April 3rd, 1882, St. Joseph, Missouri. The house on Lafayette Street had white siding and a porch that wrapped around the front. At 9 in the morning, a man named Jesse James stood in the parlor with his back to a doorway, reaching up to adjust a picture on the wall. He was 41 years old. He had been running from the law for most of his adult life, and he had gotten very good at it. But this morning, in this house, he was not running from anything. A younger man named Robert Ford stood behind him. Ford was 20 years old. He had arrived 2 days earlier. He had been welcomed. He had eaten at the same table. He had sat in the same rooms. He had earned something that very few men in the American territories ever earned from Jesse James: trust. At 9:14 in the morning, according to the best reconstruction historians have managed, Robert Ford raised the pistol he was holding and fired a single shot into the back of Jesse James's skull. The force of the bullet drove James forward. He fell across a chair. He was dead before his body finished falling. Ford stood in the doorway with smoke curling from the barrel. He did not step back. He did not run. He stood there, watching the body of the man he had killed, and waited for the world to tell him what came next. What came next was silence, and then the sound of someone calling from another room, and then footsteps, and then a gathering of people in the hallway who looked at the body and then looked at Ford, and then looked at each other with an expression that was not relief and was not horror, but something closer to recognition. The look of people who have just seen a category filled in, who have just watched a story they already knew become a little more complete. The desert has a way of revealing men, and what the desert revealed that morning was the truth about what a man looks like when he decides that the price of fame is lower than the price of silence. If you are new to this channel, you have walked into the room where the borderland keeps its stories. The ones about men who moved through the American Southwest when nobody was watching, when the law was a rumor and courage was a calculation that didn't always go the way the numbers suggested. We trace the ones who stayed too long in the wrong story and paid for it in the only currency the territories accept. Subscribe. There is always more. Let's build this one from the beginning. Robert Ford was born in 1862 in Missouri, the same state that would eventually be the site of the most famous killing in American criminal history. His family was not poor. His father was a farmer and a carpenter, a man who gave his sons enough education to read and enough discipline to survive. But Missouri in the 1860s was not a place that rewarded either of those things, and by the time Ford was 16, he had found his way into the only economy that seemed to be working: crime. He joined the gang that operated under the name of Frank James, Jesse's older brother. Not as a leader, not as a strategist. As a young man who could ride and could shoot and could be trusted in the way that young men are trusted by older criminals. Completely, but only until the moment something goes wrong. The James Younger gang operated across Missouri and adjacent states with a professionalism that has been largely lost in the romantic retelling of their story. They robbed banks. They robbed trains. They killed lawmen and civilians with equal efficiency. They were not outlaws in the legend sense. They were men who had decided that the risk of crime was lower than the certainty of poverty, and who organized their lives accordingly. Robert Ford moved through that world for several years. He was present at the robbery of the Globe Express train in 1879. He was there when things went wrong. He was there when the Pinkerton agents raided the gang's camp at the Wynn in 1874 and killed 3 men, including 2 of the younger brother's cousins. He was there for the slow dissolution that followed, the arrests, the splits, the men who walked away and the men who stayed. By 1880, the gang was fracturing. Jesse James was the last significant figure standing, and he had retreated to a series of rented houses in Missouri under a false name, surrounded by a smaller and smaller circle of men who still believed the old economy was worth maintaining. He was getting paranoid. He was getting violent. The men who were close to him knew that the paranoia was not always pointed outward. And into that space walked Robert Ford. Ford had tried to make contact with the law before. He had written to Missouri Governor Thomas Crittenden in early 1882 and offered to deliver Jesse James, alive or as a body. The governor, under pressure from a population that had watched the James gang rob and kill for over a decade, agreed to a pardon and a reward of $200. $200. That was the price on the most famous outlaw in America. Let that settle. A man who had organized bank robberies across 4 states, who had killed lawmen in 2 territories, who had become the subject of dime novels and newspaper stories, and a culture of fear that extended across the entire country. That man's life was worth $200 to the state of Missouri, and Robert Ford took the deal. He rode to St. Joseph and made contact with Jesse James through the circle of men James still trusted. Ford presented himself as a survivor of the gang's dissolution, a young man looking for work, looking for stability, looking for the kind of closeness to power that criminal organizations have always offered to men who are willing to defer to it. James accepted him. This is important to understand. Jesse James was not stupid. He was not naive. He was a man who had survived by reading people with extraordinary accuracy for over a decade. He accepted Robert Ford into his circle because Ford gave him reasons to accept him, because Ford performed trust in a way that James found convincing. The question of whether James ever suspected what was coming is one that historians have debated for over a century. The evidence suggests he did not. Ford had been in the house for 2 days. If James had been suspicious, he would not have allowed Ford close enough to shoot him in the back of the head. The trust was real, or it was performed well enough to be indistinguishable from real. On the morning of April 3rd, Ford was in the house with James and 2 other men. Charles Ford, Robert's older brother, and a man named Edward Foster. Foster was in the kitchen. Charles Ford was elsewhere in the house. James was in the parlor with his back to the doorway, adjusting a picture. The picture was one he had mounted on the wall himself, a portrait of himself in a theatrical pose, dressed in clothing that he had chosen specifically to look heroic. James was aware of his own mythology. He curated it. The picture was part of that curation. As he reached up to adjust it, Ford stepped forward. The shot was clean. It opened the back of James's skull and killed him instantly. No struggle, no sound, no warning. When Charles Ford came into the room, when he saw his brother's work, he is reported to have said something to the effect of, "You have done it," or perhaps, "It is done." The words are not preserved with certainty. What is preserved is the silence that followed. Foster came from the kitchen. He saw the body. He looked at Ford. He did not say anything that anyone recorded. The people upstairs, the family that lived in the house, who rented rooms to James, came down and saw what had happened. And then, as has always been the case in the territories after a killing, the machinery of the story began to move. The news reached the local sheriff within the hour. The sheriff reached the telegraph office within 2 hours. The story moved through the wire at the speed that information moved in 1882, which was fast enough. By the next morning, the country knew, and the country knew exactly what to call it. A newspaper in Kansas City, the Kansas City Times, published the story and used 2 words that Ford would carry for the rest of his life. 2 words that the American public, with its deep and complicated relationship with outlaws and the men who killed them, found immediately and permanently appropriate. Dirty little coward. Not because he had killed Jesse James. The country wanted Jesse James dead. The governor had offered a pardon to anyone who could deliver him. The population had been paying for his head for years through taxes that funded reward money and Pinkerton agents and federal marshals. It was not the killing that made Ford a coward. It was the method. He had shot a man in the back of the head while that man had his back turned. There was no confrontation. There was no duel. There was no moment where 2 men who understood the stakes looked at each other across a distance and made a choice. There was a young man with a pistol and a 41-year-old man reaching up to adjust a picture. The American moral vocabulary had a category for that. It has always had a category for that. And the word that fit was coward. Now, let's talk about what happened to Ford after. The governor kept his word. The pardon was issued. The $200 were paid. Robert Ford walked out of the legal process with his life, his freedom, and the thing he had sold it for. And he began the longer process of finding out what the territory thought of his work. The territory thought exactly what the newspapers said. In some towns, he was treated as a celebrity. People wanted to meet the man who had killed Jesse James. They bought him drinks. They asked questions. They wanted to know what it felt like. Ford, who had a neediness in his character that the killing had not satisfied and was probably making worse, responded to the attention. He talked. He told the story. He described the moment, the distance, the angle, the sound. And then, in other towns, the reception was different. Men in saloons looked at him with an expression that was not hostile but was not welcoming either. The look of a man who has made a calculation about another man and found the numbers insufficient. Some of those men said things. Some of those men said things that were close enough to threats that Ford understood he was now operating in a different economy than the one he had been operating in before. He was immune from the law. He was not immune from the code. The code of the borderland does not appear in any statute. It does not appear in any constitution or charter or formal document of any kind. But it operates with a consistency that formal law has never managed, because the code is not administered by institutions. It is administered by the men who live inside the territory and who understand, implicitly, what the rules are. One of those rules is that a man who shoots another from behind has placed himself outside the normal protections. He has announced in the most definitive language available that he is not going to fight fairly. And a man who will not fight fairly has removed himself from the category of men who deserve fair treatment. Ford understood this. He had lived inside that code his entire life. He knew what he had done and what it meant, and what it was going to cost him in the years that followed. The cost arrived in several installments. The first was the traveling show. After the pardon and the initial period of legal clearance, Ford did something that revealed more about his character than the killing itself. He went public. He joined a theatrical company and began performing on stages across the country in a show that reenacted the moment he killed Jesse James. He called it The Death of Jesse James. He played himself. He asked audience members to come onto the stage and watch him demonstrate in front of them exactly how he had walked into that house, how he had sat down, how he had eaten breakfast, how he had stood up and fired the shot. He recreated the scene with props and lighting and the kind of attention to detail that only a man who had lived it could provide. In some venues, the audiences cheered. In others, they sat in silence through the entire performance and left without applauding. In a few, men who had come to the show stayed after the curtain fell and approached Ford with an energy that was difficult to interpret. Not quite aggression, not quite respect, something else that lived in the space between them. Ford kept performing. He needed the money, but the money was not the primary motivation. The attention was. The attention was the thing that made him feel like a person who had done something instead of something that had been done to him. But the attention was not uniformly positive, and Ford's sensitivity to how people perceived him, the same sensitivity that had led him to seek out the governor's deal in the first place, meant that he registered every ambivalent glance, every cool handshake, every silence that lasted a half-second too long. He was not a stupid man. He understood what he was. And in the understanding was the thing that was destroying him. The second installment of the cost arrived in threats and violence. He was shot at, twice, documented attempts on his life, both of which he survived. The men who made those attempts did not claim to be doing anything other than what the code demanded. They had seen a man who had killed from behind, and they had decided that the appropriate response was to demonstrate what it felt like. Ford moved through the territories with a constant low-grade awareness of the men around him. He knew that the story preceded him in every town he entered. He knew that people knew before he introduced himself, and that the knowledge changed the room. He understood that he had made himself simple. He had reduced himself to a single act, a single morning, a single shot. And that simplicity, in the territories, has a way of becoming a target. A man who kills from behind requires no explanation. The moral category is already complete. Ford was that category now. He had chosen it when he chose the governor's offer, and it had been waiting for him every day since. In 1892, 10 years after St. Joseph, the final installment arrived. Ford was in Indian Territory, in a town called Lassiter. He was in a saloon. He had been drinking, not enough to be incoherent, but enough to slow his awareness of the room. He was standing with his back to the bar, a position that he should have known better than to assume. A man named Edward Capehart was in the saloon. Ford had killed the brother of a man named Tom McNaught several years earlier, a killing that had always carried the scent of something wrong around it, a legal trouble that had followed Ford into every territory he entered. McNaught had sent word to his friends. The message had been received. Edward Capehart had decided to act on it. He walked up behind Robert Ford, drew his pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Ford's head. One shot, the same distance, the same trajectory as the shot Ford had fired on April 3, 1882. Ford fell. He was 30 years old. He died the way Jesse James died, facing the wrong direction, with a bullet he never saw coming. The accounts of what happened next are thin, as accounts often are when a story reaches its end. The body was buried. The man who killed him was arrested and briefly held and then released, because the legal apparatus of Indian Territory in 1892 was not equipped to process a killing that happened the way this one did. There was no trial of consequence. There was no national attention. Ford's death received a brief mention in regional newspapers and then disappeared, the way most deaths in the territories did. But the question that this story keeps alive, the one that every true story eventually forces you to ask, is whether Ford ever regretted it. He never publicly expressed regret. He never apologized. He never recast the killing as something other than what it was, a calculated murder performed in exchange for a pardon and $200. But there is one detail that the historical record has preserved that says more than any statement Ford could have made. In the years after the killing, when he was performing his stage show, Ford would sometimes pause before the reenactment. He would look out at the audience, the faces lit by lamplight, the men with their hats in their laps, the women in their Sunday best, and he would say something before he began. The exact words are not perfectly preserved, but witnesses who saw the show, men who later wrote accounts of their time in the territories, described it the same way across different sources. Ford would say that the thing he had done was the thing he had to do, and that he would not tell anyone it was brave, because it was not brave. He would say that a coward can kill any man if the man turns his back, and that the only thing the killing proves is that the killer was too afraid to do anything else. Then he would act it out. The audiences that heard that stood in those theaters in those small towns across the country and watched Ford describe his own cowardice before demonstrating it, they knew they were watching a man who understood exactly what he was. Some of them had come for the story, they stayed for the honesty. And that is the part that the borderland remembers. Not the pardon, not the $200, not the traveling show that played to half-empty theaters in towns that didn't know what to do with him. A man who killed for reward and understood, in the quiet hours, in the saloons where nobody was watching, in the 10 years between the shot in Missouri and the shot in Oklahoma, exactly what he had done to himself. Robert Ford shot Jesse James in the back of the head on April 3, 1882. He spent the next 10 years dying slowly from the inside, carrying a label he could not remove and a story he could not escape. And then a man he had never met shot him in the back in a saloon in Indian Territory and closed the account that the borderland had been keeping since St. Joseph. The desert has a way of settling debts. Some of them take 10 years, some of them take longer. But the desert keeps a record, and it does not lose track of who went first, and it does not forget the weight of what a man looks like when he chooses the wrong road and walks down it anyway. If this story stayed with you, if you can feel the weight of it sitting somewhere, the way it sat in Ford's chest every morning he woke up and every night he couldn't sleep, that is the right place for it. The borderland does not offer resolution, it offers understanding, and understanding, in a place like that, is the only mercy available. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think Ford should have done differently. There is always a different road. He just did not take it. Some roads look like the only way out until you have been walking them for 10 years and realize you have been going the wrong direction the entire time. I will read every response, every single one. If you want more stories from the borderland, the ones where a man walks into a town that has already given up and something happens that the town never expected and the desert takes note of everything, subscribe. There is always more. The Southwest does not run out of men who walked into the wrong story at the wrong moment and paid for it in the only currency the desert accepts. It keeps accounts and it keeps the receipts, and it does not stop listening. Until the next one.